Hello, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast. Today, my guest is Tiffany Freer, who is an EMDR approved trainer and consultant. She is a licensed clinical social worker and has been practicing EMDR for almost a decade. And what I love about Tiffany in this podcast is that Tiffany works with children, and she has worked with children as young as 3. When kids have trauma, either a big trauma or a small trauma, sometimes they carry this maladaptive thought process or these thoughts that don't serve them, these core woundings from childhood all the way into late adulthood. So if we can work with kids and we can do that EMDR, we can reprocess those memories into more adaptive networks so that they don't have to carry that burden through their adulthood. I love this podcast with Tiffany. She is so well versed in this topic, and I feel so blessed to have her today. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to give us a like, share, and subscribe. So much gratitude if you leave a comment or a review. And I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to hop on in with my episode with Tiffany. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast, a place to explore possibility through mindfulness, movement, and self-discovery. Our intention is to deliver insight and inspiration while fostering conversations that are genuine, unfiltered, and deeply human. We hope you will enjoy today's episode. Hi, Tiffany. Good morning, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on and chatting with me today. I'm super excited because I've been looking for you. I found you. I sought you out because I've been looking for an EMDR consultant. You're a consultant and a trainer, and you've been doing this for almost a decade. And you specialize in working with kids. And I love this because I think what happens is that sometimes we have trauma that happens in our childhood and it impacts us as adults. And so I'd love for you to just start with how you got on this path of working with children.
Absolutely. I think it's a funny story. When I was 8 years old, I was a very nervous child, and I guess we could call that anxiety, but my mom decided to take me to see a therapist. And I was blown away by all the toys that she had, and I just enjoyed it so much. I just sat there and played. Somehow I guess it helped me. I don't remember that part. I just remember it was really fun. And I decided at that moment that if I could have a job like that where I got to play with toys all day, then I should go for that. So that was my the first time I decided I was going to do that. And then, of course, as I got into took some psychology classes and learned a little more, it was really interesting to me. And then I worked at a pediatrician's office through a community mental health center for 5 years and worked solely with kids. And it was really, really fun. And I learned so much during that time.
Yeah. Have you mainly specialized in working with children, or have you worked with adults too?
I've worked with adults too. So
Yeah.
now I work with all ages.
Okay. And I'm curious how working with children with EMDR is different than working with adults.
Yeah, the standard protocol, those things are the same, but you have to modify the way that you go about it. If you ask a child to hold in mind an image and determine a negative belief they have about themselves, that's not going to happen. You might as well be speaking a different language. So you're going to have to use more concrete tools. When you have an image created, a lot of times you're going to do that with a sand tray or with a drawing, something that's concrete. You're not going to be asking those abstract questions. I have a menu that I often use, and I've actually got it right here, that has all these negative beliefs on it. Some children can't read, so that's not going to work. If you've got a child who's really young, say like 4 or 5, yeah, they're not going to be able to do that at all. So it is modified. More concrete. You're not going to worry so much about the SUD, the level or the subjective unit of disturbance. Some kids may not really know if 5 or 6 is higher. So you're going to use tools. You might use your hands to show this big or this big, how disturbing something is. But it's just a lot more concrete and a lot more
Mm-hmm.
active. Kids may not just sit in front of a light bar and do
Yeah.
set. I've walked around my office and tapped on kids' shoulders. Um, there's a lot of movement involved, so it looks very different, even though the standard protocol is the same.
Yeah. I'm curious what's the youngest age you can work with?
So the youngest child that I've ever done EMDR with was 5. He was my very, very first EMDR client, ironically,
Oh
as
my
a
gosh.
child client. And he was pretty advanced for his age. So he was able to give me a negative cognition, but it wasn't about him self-referencing. It was daddy's mean. And that worked
Mm,
really fine. So he was able to do eye movements at the age, it was just not normally eye movements, children 5 and under really struggle to track. So you have to use like tapping. You can use auditory, but 5 is the earliest that I have done that standard protocol on. There are other protocols that you can use for younger children. There was one that was developed by Joan Lovett. It's a therapeutic story technique, and that is a little different than what we're talking about. I've done that with children as young as 3.
my gosh. Wow.
Yeah.
When you're working with adults, what
Mhm.
is the youngest age you can roll back to with a memory? So if they have a memory that's really vivid when they're 3 or 4, can you work with that?
Yes. I think 3 is the youngest memory that I've worked on with an adult. We rolled back. We did something called a float back. We were working
Hmm.
on a different memory. We got very stuck. We did a float back, and a 3-year-old memory popped in. And then we were able to just go to that. It was a feeder memory, and we were able to reprocess that. So that's pretty early. I'd say for me personally, 3 is the youngest that I've.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
And what is the advantage of doing EMDR with children? Because I'm guessing what I like about EMDR is that there doesn't necessarily need to be a story that's cohesive in
Right.
order to work with EMDR. And so you
Mhm.
can work with those feelings and those emotions and everything around it. And some kids
Sure.
maybe can't have that concrete story. And so I'm curious, what are some of the advantages?
Yeah, one of the big advantages, honestly, is that if you work with a child when their trauma is newer, they don't have a full lifetime to go through of having
Yeah.
these internalized negative self beliefs. Because then, if you've got a person who's got a lot of trauma and then they go into another adverse experience, it's internalized differently. So if they have, say, they're bullied really, really badly when they're 8, and they never really work through that, and then something happens in high school, it just reinforces what happened earlier. But if you work through that trauma at a younger age, um, then they're not going to internalize it as much or at all as somebody who hasn't worked through their trauma when they're young. And yeah, it is nice for kids to be able to not have to have this cohesive story. You get really creative. I think that's another advantage with kids is you can be really creative and spontaneous when you're doing this work. Um, so yeah, and they don't have to talk about the trauma. When we talk about other forms of trauma treatment, there's a lot of telling the story. But in this case, we're not doing that. We're not having them talk about the details. And so that's really beneficial. A lot of kids don't want to talk about the details. And so we just kind of, whatever they bring up, we can go with that. We can
Hmm.
work with that, whether that be a feeling, a body sensation, a thought, a memory, any of those pieces. We can just work with that.
Hmm.
Pretty neat.
I'm curious if kids get overwhelmed as adults do when they go into something that's maybe not a deep trauma. Let's go with little traumas. Do
Huh?
they get dysregulated like adults do?
They do. They do. I one of the first kiddos that I worked with, I didn't realize how dysregulated he was going to get. we were working on a broken leg. He broke his leg, and it was a bicycle accident. And I was really
Mhm.
surprised. He kind of just shut down and started bawling, and just
Mm.
completely fell out of his window of tolerance. I couldn't work with him in that moment. So I was very surprised. It can look different, for different kids. Sometimes that dysregulation is just they they just check out, they walk away, they're like, hey, miss, do you have any more goldfish? Or, they're just not, they're telling you, I'm out of my window of tolerance. I can't do this. So it can look different, but absolutely they can fall out of their window of tolerance. And we have to spend a lot of time in the preparation phase. We have to make sure they've got resources,
Mhm.
same as
Okay, yeah.
adults,
Yeah,
adaptive
yeah,
networks they can link into.
yeah.
Mhm.
I wanted to bring up an example. I was reading about this earlier, where because we define trauma in this day and age, like people think of the big traumas, the big T
Mhm.
traumas, and they're
Yeah.
little T traumas, but they can seem so small and insignificant, but have such a lasting impact. So the example I pulled up was a 6-year-old's really excited about their drawing, and the
Hmm.
parent is preoccupied with work. And so they say to the kid, not now. And they don't even look up to look at the artwork. And then this happens repeatedly for this kid. And so what happens is the kid feels dismissed, they feel unimportant, and they maybe feel ashamed for wanting the attention. And what happens is this kid then internalizes this as what I have to say doesn't matter, or I'm not worth listening to. And then as adults, they have difficulty speaking up, and they minimize their needs and relationships, and they may have intense shame when they're not heard. So it could be because we don't look at this as trauma. And I feel like every single human on this planet's walking around with some kind of trauma. But this is something so tiny and so insignificant that we don't think might have an impact, but it could have a lasting impact from 6 years old all the way into adulthood. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about this piece of it.
Absolutely. I am so happy that you brought that up because I see that more and more. I think that 90% of the issues that I work with go back to some kind of attachment rift or some kind of experience just like that you're describing. And so what happens is people don't recognize that. They completely don't even remember that happening. In a lot of cases they say, like, I felt this way my whole life and I have no reason for feeling this way. I had a great childhood
Mm-hmm.
and everything was wonderful. And it takes a lot of digging to figure out where those things came from. So you have to remember that memories are stored state dependently. And so if a 6-year-old is told, I don't have time for you, I'm working really hard, I can't do this right now, they're going to internalize it at the age that it happened, right? So 6-year-old, they're going to have body sensations, the feelings, the internalized cognitions at the age of 6. And that is
Mm-hmm.
stored in the brain. And if it happens repeatedly, remember what Dan Siegel says, neurons that fire together wire together. And those are in those neural networks. And there's many of them because it happens a lot. So as that person goes through life, as you said, those beliefs are reinforced. They could say they get bullied, say they get a bad grade on a test. And so, yeah, that gets reinforced and reinforced. Um, so really, it really impacts their mental model of the world when something like that happens. And now, as an adult, they may look back and they're in your therapy office and you're trying to talk about this. And they look back on things like that and they're like, oh, that's so silly. Why would that affect me?
Yeah.
I feel really, you said it, shamed. Why would I need that attention? They don't understand that at the age of 6, that felt very different. And so logically, they can say, I realize that I'm good enough, but this sense of not being good enough or not being worthy, not mattering, it's activated, and it's a felt sense of not feeling good enough because all of those neuronal connections are holding all of that information. But their adult brain can maybe say, oh, but I realized that my parent was really busy and they were trying to put food on the table, they were trying to take care of me. That's adult brain. Okay,
Yeah.
so neurologically, all of that other stuff is still there. It's still stored there. And so that's why, you have that discrepancy between what people logically know, but what they feel is very different. And it's because of those patterns, those early patterns from childhood that you're describing happens all the time.
Yeah, I feel like those are core wounding. Those I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable, all of those core woundings when we're little.
It's very, very,
Yeah.
very common and dismissed.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I would love for people that aren't super familiar with EMDR to talk
Mhm.
about what happens with EMDR and what happens with our brain and how
Mhm.
it changes those maladaptive thoughts and
Yeah.
works with them so that there's synthesis in the different parts of the brain.
That's right. So, yes, as I said, neurons that fired together, wired together. So, all of your experiences are fired and wired in the brain throughout your life. So, I tell people all the time, if you've learned to ride a bike, you've experienced this. All of the learnings of riding a bike go into those neural networks, and you can't unlearn those things, right? You can't
Hmm.
just undo those neural networks. It would be kind of great if we could, because we could just undo all that wounding. Doesn't happen that way. So you've got these maladaptive memory networks that are holding these, all of the different aspects of a memory, all of the sensory information, the images, the feelings, the body sensations, even an action urge can be part of those memory networks, like an urge to run or an urge to fight. That can all be in those networks.
Hmm.
And so what happens with EMDR is we activate those memory networks. And then through the bilateral stimulation, we create synthesis between those maladaptively stored networks and the adaptive networks. So the synthesis begins to occur. So what I tell people is what you logically know, all of that beautiful stuff as an adult, that you succeeded in school, for example, that you have people that love and support you. That information, that adaptive information, gets synthesized in those stuck
Hmm.
networks of that are saying, I wasn't worth paying attention to, and I feel so unworthy. That gets activated and then synthesized with the adaptive, and then it shifts over
Hmm.
time. The more memories that you reprocess, the more shift you start to notice.
I
So,
mean, the thing I think that's so interesting about all this is and I'll give grief because everyone can conceptualize grief, but
right.
if there's something that happens and there is a lot of really intense grief that somebody's wanting to work through, when they think of that person, maybe they have the image of them passing or
Mhm.
like when they were really sick or whatever that accident was that they had and they were in the
Yeah.
hospital. And then as these things start to process with EMDR, what happens is those really intense memories begin to fade. And then all of these beautiful, forgotten memories come forward. So when they think back to that experience, they think about all the good things that happened and all the great experiences with this person. And it's the same with these childhood things where sometimes kids or adults, we block out chunks or
Mhm.
years of our childhood and we can't remember anything good that happened. And then as we start to work through these maladaptive processes, then all of these positive memories come flooding back in. I think that's so incredibly interesting.
That does happen. It does happen sometimes where someone will say, we're working on bullying. They got bullied when they were a child, and then all of a sudden they're like, "Oh yeah, I remember now. This person stood up for me." Like that was kind of not part of the that's part of the memory network, but now they're starting to remember those things, and those are synthesized into what stuck that said, "I had no friends." Oh yeah, I did have a friend. I'm remembering now. So that does happen. But what's
Hmm.
really, really important to remember is they need to make sure, as an EMDR clinician, we need to make sure that they do have access to those adaptive memory networks. If you've got somebody who doesn't, like they struggle to feel positive at all,
Mm.
anytime you say, "Hey, tell me about a time you were proud of yourself," and they say, "There's no time." I'm like, "Well, you did really well in school." Yeah, but that was expected. Everyone did well in school. Okay, so that means they're going to struggle to access those adaptive memory networks, and that synthesis might not occur. You have to really work to create those networks, to build those up in order for that to happen. And that is true for kids and adults the same.
Hmm.
So something to keep in mind.
What's the process for that?
The process for that, and it depends, but a lot of it with kids especially is very experiential. So we're
Hmm.
doing things together. We're having dance parties and we're laughing together. And I'm like, doesn't it feel good to laugh? Like there's an adaptive network.
Hmm.
Um, it could be something more creative, like let's create some superheroes that are going to help us. We know there was no superheroes in that yucky memory, but we can create some. Or let's imagine that your dog is going to be part of this and your dog can come into the memory. So it can be lots of things. And you can get that creative with adults too, just that we tend to be a little more realistic and close minded, not as much fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like that, helping them to connect to even moment to moment stuff that's happening in the office. Mhm. Celebrating their daily wins. Like if you find out they come in and they've did good on a test or something, it's that moment of like celebrating.
Right. And so
Mhm.
is this correct that if they come in and they got an A on a test and you want to
Mhm.
celebrate that and they're
Mhm.
not seeing that they feel like they're stupid or whatever, and they have those little wins that you can
Mhm.
install those positive networks with that
Yes.
that thing that just happened? I'd love for you to chat a little bit about that because I think that's
Mhm.
really unique to EMDR and I think it's really powerful.
Definitely. So the way we install things as EMDR clinicians is we engage the client in bilateral stimulation. We engage them in slow, short sets of bilateral stimulation. When we are doing trauma reprocessing, our bilateral stimulation is much faster. But when we are installing, it's much slower because we're not trying to stir up any trauma memories. So we don't want to go fast, we want to go slow. And so, what it can look like, adults and kids both, is okay, notice that feeling that you're having, notice those happy feelings, where are they in your body, just pay attention to those. And you can either say follow my fingers, I have puppets, follow the finger puppets. You can say okay, let's tap this in together. Or you can like stomp around your office and be like, let's stomp this in, because with kids, you're moving, so it's like stomp, 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 stomp. It can be anything. I had one kid, we would just throw the ball. He had a ball. He would throw back and forth because he needed that movement. So just noticing those positive feelings and where they're living in the body, helping them connect, and then just nice, slow, short bilateral, and then checking in. So, how are you feeling? I'm feeling really good. Okay, let's keep going. Keep noticing that. And then we just keep going with the bilateral. I say about 2 or 3 sets of that.
Hmm.
And there's a resource. And then I'll say, hey, when you're feeling sad this week, can we bring that up? Can you bring up those feelings to see if you can shift it a little? It's okay to feel sad, but let's see if you have some control here and practice. Mhm.
Do you feel like those stick pretty well with them?
Yeah, I do. And the more time you spend doing those activities, the better they stick, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And some kids come in with those. Like, they're like, I had one kid, oh my gosh, she brought in a story about how great she was. So awesome. And I was like, I don't think we got to do a lot of resourcing here. This kiddo is pretty connected to her strengths. And then other kids, not so much. So,
Hmm.
yeah. It's about that relationship, honestly, Nick. It's building that relationship and helping them feel safe with you and important.
Yeah. What percent of the time with kids are you working to install positive resources?
Mhm. Percent of the time, I would say that we're doing that much of the time. I mean, even when we're processing, I might still be working on activating or finding new resources. You know what I mean? Like, so
Hmm.
at least half the time.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I had a kid in here earlier, and we did some EMDR, some reprocessing. But then, even after we were done, we were building Legos together. And just that is a really awesome resource for this kid. It gives him control. And I can point out, wow, it's amazing that you can put those things together, and I can point out his strengths while we're just playing Legos together. And so
Hmm.
that's happening even after we just finished doing some reprocessing. We're still helping him access those strengths.
Yeah. I'd asked you this before when we were chatting, because I'm an adoptive mom,
Mm,
and I have this belief that kids that come from adoption, no matter how amazing we are as adoptive parents, they
mhm.
come with a trauma, and that trauma happened before they were verbal, and there's no understanding of the trauma because it's as far back as they can remember. And so if
Right.
I were to come to you with my child, how and can you work with that?
That's a wonderful question. And it absolutely is so common with adopted kiddos, or adults will tell me, I don't know why, but I feel like I've got this hole in my heart. I don't remember
Mhm.
anything about the adoption, but there's just something that's missing. And it's a felt sense because, again, neurons fire and wire, and they may have heard their mother's voice for, all of those times that they were in the womb, and then it's gone.
Mhm.
And it's missing, and it's a felt sense. So the way that I would work with that, I would not there's a couple ways to do this. If they're adults, sometimes
Mhm.
I will use standard protocol on the first time they remember learning that they were adopted.
Yeah.
We'll see how if we can use that. But if it's a child, what we will often do is use that therapeutic story technique that was initially developed by Joan Levitt. And so that is where you're telling the story in often third person, and you're using the language that is relevant to the kid, of course, and you're not giving too much information.
Mhm.
You're not talking about what happened to the parents, they were into drugs. You're not doing that. You're saying things like, once upon a time, there was a little girl and she was born beautiful and strong. But like all other children, she had some confusing things happen to her. And so throughout the process, you're going through some of the confusing things that happened. You're going through the wonderful things that happened. Those are the resources. And then in this process, you're talking also about what the little girl may have felt, what the little girl may have thought. So you're addressing the feelings, you're addressing the negative cognitions, but you're doing it through a story. And then as
Mm.
part of the story, you are saying, but the truth was that this little girl was always beautiful and she was always safe and she was loved. And you're talking about the adaptive information. You might talk about the adoptive parents coming in and choosing her and holding her close and wanting to be with her. And you're activating maladaptively stored networks, and you're
Mhm.
synthesizing the positive networks with those, and that's how that works. But you're not using standard protocol because you can't say,
Yeah.
what image do you get and what words come with that image that express a negative belief. You can't do
So how
that.
are you doing the EMDR with that?
You are running bilateral stimulation as you're reading the story. And then you may
Oh,
pause and
okay.
say, so what are you noticing? Do you, in some cases, you might say, can the little girl feel those sad feelings now? And the child might say, yes. You say, just notice those feelings, those sad feelings, and run some bilateral stimulation. There are a couple ways to do that. People have made modifications off of that original therapeutic story.
Yeah.
So there are some advanced trainings on ways to do that. There is a technique I'll just briefly mention because you wouldn't do it with young children, but it does address early trauma. And I use it with adults. And it was developed by Sandra Paulson and Katie O'Shea, and it's called the Early Trauma Protocol. So that's also out there.
I'm actually curious about that because I'm thinking about people I've worked with
Mhm.
as a therapist where they are sure that there was sexual abuse around the
Mhm.
age of 3, say,
Mhm.
but there's no memory of it, but their body remembers.
Yeah, because trauma is stored as fragments, right? Trauma
Yeah.
fragments. So you could have an image
Yeah.
of something and not know where it came from. You can have a body sensation and have no clue why. A thought, an image, any of these things can be fragments. And you can target a body sensation. You really
Mm-hmm.
can. Using the standard protocol. Will they remember? Maybe, but maybe not. Again, it's activating a piece of that memory network and trying to synthesize it with adaptive information. So yeah, that does happen. What often does occur is when you're doing the bilateral stimulation, it's almost like it knits the fragments together. So more information will often become synthesized. So they're often they might say, okay, wait, I'm starting to remember part of this. They will start to remember in a lot of cases. I hesitate to say always because there
Yeah.
are times when that doesn't happen. But
And
for some
yeah,
people,
and I know a lot of people that have had this experience of sexual abuse at a really young age or something similar. And and they'd forgotten about it, and through maybe plant medicine journeys,
yeah.
this has come back to them. And then I've also known in the same circumstance where they've gotten these visions, and I know multiple people where this happened, where they've gotten these visions and these images, and then
Mhm.
there's not clarity at all if it actually happened or not.
Yes.
Their body remembers some kind of trauma, and I think that their head has created some kind of story, and then they're not sure if the story is accurate, and that can get really confusing the more they kind of go into the story in their head. And
Mhm.
so I'm curious, because I know that this has probably come up, how
Mhm.
you manage that.
Absolutely. Um, One of the things I like about being a therapist and especially EMDR is we're not fact checkers. We're not trying to find out if this happened or that happened. We're not saying, oh man, you were definitely sexually abused. It's obvious.
Mm-hmm.
You're not doing that. You're saying, I wasn't there. I don't know what's happening. And you're going alongside them in the journey and you're just being curious about
Mm-hmm.
what shows up. You're not trying to make too much meaning. That's their job. Let them make the meaning. um, Whatever is stored there, it's stored there. You can have a memory that maybe it didn't actually happen that way, but it is stored in that manner that is impacting them in their current life. So oftentimes it's just targeting what they have and just being curious about what shows up, not trying to say, oh, this is absolute proof. Unless in some cases I have had people go, oh gosh, and they remember. I mean, they really remember, and that does happen. But like you said, it doesn't always happen. But example, I mean, um, okay, so my son has a memory. I don't know how he got this memory, but he has a memory of me in his preschool getting angry at him for making a letter wrong. Now, first of all, I wasn't in preschool standing there doing that. I'm wondering if it was a dream, but I got really mad at him in this memory. And
Mm-hmm.
even now, well, not anymore because he's worked through this, but he used to get very teary when you would
Mm-hmm.
talk about it. So I took him to an EMDR therapist. And I said, he's got a memory. And I was mean to him in this memory. And I'd like him to talk to you about that. And he did reprocess that, but it was something that I can tell you, I would never walk into his preschool and I would never yell at him for making a mistake. But in this memory, he did. And so it's interesting because that for me was a really, it hit home how something that didn't happen. I never screamed at him or yelled at him, period. But especially you wouldn't do that for writing a letter wrong. How that was stored in those networks and it was
Mm-hmm.
impacting him. So for me, that helps me understand how that happens because it was very real to me. So you think about something more maybe more serious, sexual abuse. I never am there to say yes it happened, no it didn't, but man, that is real, and that's not my job. And so I'm just going to be curious about it. I'm going to help them work through that process and just be present and open
Mm-hmm.
to what shows up. And that's how I handle it.
And EMDR can bring up some information sometimes that could potentially be inaccurate.
Mm. Um, yeah, I mean, in this case with my son, I mean, I
Right.
didn't ever do that.
Right.
So it's not about finding out what happened. That's something
Right.
to remember. It's not, remember, state dependent. Memories are stored state dependently.
Mm-hmm.
So the perceptions are part of the memory network. those perceptions are internalized at the age they happen. So that's what we need to remember. Now, if someone says, I absolutely have this memory of my uncle or my aunt doing this thing to me, this happened, I'm not going to say, well, I don't know if it did. I'm going to say,
Right,
okay,
right. Yes, it
that's
did. To
different. In
them, it
fact, we
did.
might even need to make a phone call, right? We might need to call the authorities. But for the most part, when you're working with adults, it's pretty vague. And if they had the memory, yeah, you're not challenging it and saying that didn't happen, but you're also not there going, I know this happened to you. We've got to figure this out. We've got to make sense of this. That's not what
Mhm.
we're doing. Yeah.
So in the case of somebody who knows something happened to their body and they know that when they're around a certain person that they feel unsafe, and then they've created a story that they don't know if is accurate or not, you would just work with the feeling of when they imagine that person or what they're feeling in their body, because the story has zero importance, really.
I would probably work with the trigger, the trigger of, when you see this person's face, for example,
Mm-hmm.
what image goes with it? What are the negative words that, express a negative belief about yourself? I would go through the standard protocol and see what shows up.
Yeah. Yeah. And then with the kids, sometimes our kids will say things. My kid has said this. He'll say, I'm
Mhm.
stupid or I'm a bad boy. And I'm thinking, where in the world did he pick this up from? So, from
Yeah.
what you're saying, the earlier we can capture those and reprogram that information, the
Mhm.
better, so that they don't have to carry that burden for 10 years.
Right. Exactly. They'll internalize things that aren't true. Um, and it's funny. Kids are black and white thinkers, and
Mm-hmm.
so if say a parent acts in a poor manner,
Mm-hmm.
um, and they are flat out abusive, they're not going to say, mommy is bad. That's really, really, that's too
Yeah.
scary. Like, they depend on this person for their life. It's going to be internalized as I'm bad. So they're going to think I'm bad. Now, I'm not saying in your case, especially where your son's saying that you've done something that he's
Yeah, yeah, I hear you.
internalized. But no, I mean, kids typically do turn it in on themselves. They'll say,
Yeah.
I'm a terrible kid. And you're just like, whoa, what the heck? Where did that come from? The way they're internalizing it is false. And what you're saying is, if you can reprocess that, if you can have them work through that, then
Mm-hmm.
you're correct. They're not going to carry that through the rest of their life where everything is more
Mm-hmm.
evidence that they're bad.
I mean, it's the same when parents get divorced or a kid has been sexually abused or physically abused. The idea that the person that's supposed to be their caretaker and love them
Mm-hmm.
unconditionally isn't that, or isn't as they expect it, because that's our sense of safety and security and stability in the
It,
world, that we can't fathom that as kids. And so there's always this internalization and self-blaming and shaming when anything like that happens, when any kind of trauma happens, the kids internalize it. And that's what's so tricky, is I'm imagining the earlier the trauma, the bigger the wound.
Correct. Yes, you're 100% right. Right. So we're hardwired to connect to our caregivers. Like, that is something deeply ingrained in us. Kids will cut off their arm to attach to their caregivers. So you've got this attachment system that's part of their makeup, right? And then that system is in complete contrast with fight or flight. So you've got the attachment system getting activated at the same time the fight or flight system gets activated. How does a kid make sense of that?
Mm,
You know what I mean? So one way to make sense of it is, I'm the problem. I'm bad. And so it's false, but it feels more real, and it's safer. It's much safer to believe I'm bad than to believe mom or
yeah.
dad is abusive and can't. I mean, that's their life is in danger, right? So that's some of how that internalization happens.
Well, and
And
go ahead.
to your point earlier, that's really extreme when I'm talking about abuse. But the same thing when you've got the 6-year-old who's like, look at my picture. And they're
Yes.
like dismissing over and over. It's, I'm bad. So
I'm
yeah.
not important. I'm not worthy. I'm not lovable.
Yeah. I don't
Yeah.
matter. Yeah.
And then, yeah. And then they carry that through decades in their
Yeah.
life.
And if you point it
Yeah.
out, they say, oh my gosh, I must have been such a needy kid that I needed so much attention. It's like, well, every child needs attention. You're hardwired. That's what keeps you alive, and
Yeah.
is to create that connection, you know. And if that's missing, that creates problems. It really does,
Hmm.
and it's not needy. It's the way it is. Everyone needs that attention. Every
Yeah.
human.
And I feel like the EMDR, my understanding of it is it kind of drops us back into a memory
Hmm.
that was traumatic. And then
Hmm.
it brings us into the present. And then it drops us back into that past and it brings us into the
Hmm.
present. So there's this touch in the past. And so we're not getting stuck in it. And then there's this touchstone in the future. And then that's
Right.
how that synthesis happens, is bringing those together so that we can make sense and understanding of what happened.
Mhm.
And it's through that process of bouncing from past to present to past to present. Is that right?
Right. There's incongruence in that because they're dipping their toe into the trauma, right? They're not reliving it. We don't want them to
Mm-hmm.
relive it because then they'll fall out of their window of tolerance. But they're dipping their toe, they're activating it. They're staying in their window of tolerance, but then it's interrupted. We interrupt the process and say, well, what are you noticing now? And they're giving us an answer. Well, this is incongruent to the trauma. You've got the safety of the therapist, you've got the safety of the therapist's office, and then you're dipping into the trauma. So you're going back and forth and it's interrupted. It's like
Mm-hmm.
brief exposure, very controlled exposure, and then it's interrupted.
Yeah.
And eye movements also activate the parasympathetic nervous system. So there's a compelled relaxation response. At the same time, they've activated this memory network, this trauma. So there's a lot of mechanisms involved in the process.
Yeah. I've had this experience where I've moved through some of my own trauma where um, I felt this trauma was stuck in my body, and I was working with somebody, and um, I would go back in the trauma, I'd get a little stuck, and then I would dip into the present. It was a somatic experience.
Uh huh.
And then I would dip back and forth, and it was amazing because afterwards there was been a lot of talk therapy around this for a long time, but after that specific experience, well, that and another one of kind of dipping back and forth and back and forth, and then also it's kind of like EMDR where you float back, where all of these memories started to link together, and they were
Mm-hmm.
all super random. But then at some point, it was like, oh my gosh, there was a thread amongst all of them, and it was really
Mm-hmm.
interesting being in this process myself and as a therapist and seeing how I was dipping back and coming to the future and dipping back. And then afterwards, how it just cleared it all. Like it cleared it
Right.
from my body and it cleared it. It was like the onion layer had been peeled through talk and other things. And then I got like right into the core and it cleared it. That's what I think of with EMDR is it's that same process where it just clears.
Yeah, I think of bilateral stimulation as it's like knitting together a quilt. And so you've got the pieces, all these pieces and scraps of material that don't make a lot of sense. There's not a lot of organization. There's no beginning, middle, or end. It's just all kind of a mess. And then as you work through whatever scrap gets picked up or that's or remembered, it starts to knit together. And then there's a beginning and a middle and an end. And then once that happens, it kind of gets filed away in a cabinet. You remember it, right? But it doesn't hurt. It's there, it's knowledge, but it doesn't feel that way anymore. So yeah, I always describe it as knitting a quilt together. So the body fragment, those pieces are part of that, and a thread starts to appear. And then suddenly it kind of makes sense. And now it's a beginning, a middle, and an end. That does happen.
And I think as adults, that's one way we can tell if we've worked through a trauma or not, is when
Mhm.
we think about that person or that event or
Mhm.
that circumstance. Do
Yeah.
we feel triggered in our body, and does it escalate the feelings
Right.
in our nervous system, or can we just think of it without all of that activation, and that's how we know if it needs more processing or not, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Because you'll always recognize that it's disturbing, right? You'll say, gosh, you can't look back at something like a school shooting and
Hmm.
tell me that's not disturbing anymore. But it doesn't feel, the feelings, like you just said, the activation of the nervous system isn't happening. Cognitively, we know that someone being abused is disturbing, but the
Hmm.
person who's worked through the trauma can look back at that. They can even talk about it and see it as it happens here. Maybe they've created some meaning around it, some positive meaning around it. Maybe now they're equipped to help other people is an example of that. It
Hmm.
happened, but it is not happening anymore. And I can protect myself, and I've grown up, and whatever other adaptive information they have. But
Hmm.
yeah,
It makes me
it's
think of a car accident, because anytime anybody's been in a car accident or I've been in a car accident, the next time getting in the car, I'm really hyper vigilant and I'm a little bit uptight and I'm really tense for a couple
mm-hmm,
of weeks. And then,
mm-hmm.
I look back months later and it's just like I get in the car and I drive off and it's not a big deal. But at first, getting in that car and getting behind the wheel is a very intense experience, and it's very overwhelming to the nervous system.
What you're describing, I'm glad you pointed that out, because that experience may happen without doing any EMDR, because we have this adaptive information processing system. Our brains naturally move towards what is adaptive. It's those traumatic experiences when it's like maybe you were too young to process that to an adaptive conclusion, or maybe it happens so many times repeatedly that it gets stuck, is kind of the way I think of it. But so a car accident, for a while, it really sticks with you, right? But over time, your brain starts to move towards what's adaptive. Now, for some people, that doesn't happen. They get in a car accident,
Yeah.
6 months later, they're not driving. They're like, I still can't drive. Every time I get behind a car, my body just gets so tense and I go into panic mode. That's when EMDR would be beneficial. But for some people, it's just the body, the brain does it naturally.
Yes. And in that example, if there is this inability to move through that experience and they're still
Mhm.
holding on to that, then there is likely an much earlier experience that gives them, maybe they create that I'm not safe, or whatever that is, their core
Mhm.
wounding in that experience. And then that usually goes way back to an earlier time in their life.
That's a really good point. Yeah. So why does one person clear
Yeah.
just without even having to do any work? It just naturally happens. And then some people don't, they're stuck. And you're right. 9 times out of 10, I'm going to tell you that there is something earlier that happened that shook their sense of safety in some manner. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are all EMDR therapists licensed if they are through the EMDRIA certified program?
To be certified, if you want to get your certification, you must be licensed. You do not have to have your license to go through basic training.
You don't.
So
So
you
there,
can be basic trained.
yeah. And so can you talk to people about when somebody's looking for an EMDR therapist, what are the different levels and what should they look for if they're wanting somebody that's really experienced?
Right. So there's yeah, the different levels. The first level would be that you are basic trained, and I'm going to encourage people to look for someone who was basic trained by an EMDRIA approved training. EMDRIA is the body that kind of oversees all of this. Francine Shapiro developed EMDR, and so she was the one. She kind of through a bunch of research, not just Francine's research, but other people's research, the standard protocol was developed. And so EMDRIA oversees that. And so finding a person who's been trained by some place that is EMDRIA approved is going to go a lot farther, because not all EMDR programs are. There
Mm.
are some that are simply 3 days and you're done.
Oh my gosh. That's
Unlike, yeah,
actually
we were just,
dangerous. Well, before you go on, I'd like for you to talk about why that's not okay, because that can create more trauma for people if they are with a therapist that isn't skilled and trained well.
it's not okay for that reason exactly. They're not trained, and they don't understand the importance of screening for dissociation, spending a lot of time on the front end resourcing someone, making sure they have lots and lots of adaptive networks. The EMDRIA approved programs require those things. you have to screen for dissociation. You spend a lot of time learning about resourcing and what's happening in the brain and why. You learn the why. Those other trainers, a lot of times it's 3 days, you learn the process, you're done. And so those clinicians being absolutely well intended. I mean, they want to learn. That's it, but they don't know. And then they can hurt people and not mean to. I don't think it's done in malice, but yeah, it's very important that someone has gone through the proper training that goes through all of those different steps, that you understand why. That's really important. Understand, why are you building these resources? Why are you screening for dissociation? Why are you going through these phases in this order? That's really important to understand. So damage can be done. If you find a therapist who says they're EMDR trained, ask them, where did you get trained? And maybe do a search engine and look it up and see if it's EMDR approved.
Yes, that's super important.
Yeah.
And then what are the certifications? Can you talk about that?
Yes. So once a person is basic trained, fully basic trained, they have gone through a very intense program. And we were talking about this before. Yes, they have done many, many hours of consultation. They have practiced. They've practiced with clients, but it's basic. So they've learned the very basics of EMDR, kind of the bare bones of EMDR. Certified is somebody who has spent an additional year, probably, maybe more, and they have done an additional 20 hours of consultation. And they have done at least 50 hours of EMDR with 25 different clients. So they have a extensive knowledge of EMDR and working with different populations, different people, different diagnoses. That's the next phase. So having that extra year does often mean that you know more. It's because you've been experienced more. And then the next phase from that is someone who's an approved consultant. That means that they have done another, they've worked with, I think it's 75 different clients, and they have done, I want to say it's like 300 hours of EMDR, and they are actually helping other clinicians get their certifications by providing consultation. So if you want somebody, they've probably gotten a good 3 years after the basic training of additional experience.
Yeah. And I do think, the more I'm learning about this modality, and I'm being trained in it right now too, the more I realize that a lot of harm can be done, and that it's really important that the therapist is skilled and that they know what they're doing, because you can create more trauma for people if people terminate early, if they aren't resourced properly, if they're not within their window of tolerance, and a lot of things can come up in between sessions. And so you don't want people to terminate early, and you want everything explained really well. And so I do see a lot of danger in just going through some quick program.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like to share about EMDR and kids that we haven't touched on? I love this specialty because I feel if we can catch our kids early, even those little things like I'm stupid or I'm bad or whatever that is, a skilled therapist can probably move through all of those pretty quickly with kids, I'm guessing. And then we're saving them years of unnecessary hardship.
Kids were processed pretty fast. Their memory networks are shorter than ours. So you're right. Something to keep in mind with kids, they get bored. They require a little bit more excitement. And I guess what I'm saying is making it fun is important, as fun as possible. There's some really great trainers out there. Anna Gomez is someone who does a lot of work with kids, and I highly recommend her trainings. Her advanced trainings are fabulous. Lots of great ideas on how to keep kids engaged, work with dissociation, how to resource kids, how to involve the families. Because we've also got families involved when we're working with kids. It's not just a single individual. That's another thing to keep in mind. But being very creative, making it fun. And then honestly, I would say one of the biggest important things to keep in mind is try to get rid of your agenda. Like, you know what is going to be helpful for this kid, but you also have to be able to go with it. Like, if they come in and they're just, it's not happening today for whatever reason, you cannot force it. You cannot force it. So you're going to have to be flexible and creative. And sometimes I used to have a saying, I would say, if in doubt, just play Uno. You know what I mean? Just connect with them on something else. Just
Right.
do
Well, you're building
something.
relationship and trust.
Yes, because that is an adaptive network, remember. So just spending that time with them, that's creating adaptive networks. That is resourcing, just being that person who's safe.
Yeah.
That's going to help
Yeah.
down the road when they're ready to do the trauma work. Having you who have spent all that time playing Uno and talking about things that you didn't think were relevant at the time, maybe, but they really were, like
Hmm.
whatever, drama at school, those are really
Yeah.
important. It's really important to meet them where they're at. Another thing I want to say really quick to keep in mind is sometimes kids are still living in the trauma because they're living with the dismissive parent.
Yeah.
And so you are not a magician. You're not going to just fix everything magically with the EMDR. Sometimes it's just recognizing what you can get done and accepting what you can't. Right. So if
Hmm.
you've
And
got a
that's probably
parent,
really hard at first
it's
to
so hard.
learn that.
Yes, some parents are
Yeah.
beautiful and you can bring them into sessions and do a lot of great repair work, and some not so much. And that's something that I want to encourage EMDR clinicians that work with kids not to take that on, is like, I'm not doing a good job. Um, we cannot, sometimes we just have to accept what we can't change and then find what we can and work with that. Maybe just
Yeah.
helping people not internalize some of the continued verbal slights that they get can be powerful, but that's even tricky to do in that system. So
Yeah.
just, yeah, that's where I do a lot of consultation on that with people who work with kids, is trying to figure out what we can work on and what we just can't. And maybe we just need to be that person that plays Uno and that's safe and listens and attunes to them, you know?
Yeah. I mean, even that, when they're an adult, they can think about that safe person or that teacher or that mentor that believed in them and that they felt safe with. And that's actually a big thing.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
valuable. That's just as valuable as notice that and follow.
Right. Right. Tiffany, how do people reach you and what are some of your offerings? And I'm going to put all your links in the show notes as well.
Yes, the best way to reach me is through my email address, which is basically tiffany@greenwoodcounselingcenter.com. Pretty long. I offer individual therapy. I work with kids of all ages. I work with adults. I joke, I say I work with people who are 4 to 84. Um, the youngest I've done EMDR with, I said, is a 3-year-old, but that involved a lot of family, a lot of parent work as
Yeah.
well. Um, yeah, that's the main thing. And then complex trauma. I work with a lot of complex trauma, high levels of dissociation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for being a consultant and a trainer in this method. And I love that you're working with kids because I don't think that there's a lot of EMDR therapists that are
Mhm.
specialized in this area. And I think it's really important.
Yeah, no, I love what I do, and I love working with other therapists to train them up to do EMDR with kids. That's one of my passions. It's like, bring more on. We need you so bad. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you,
and thank
Tiffany, so
you, thank
much. I
you for getting
appreciate
trained,
you.
because I know you're
Yes.
getting trained right now.
Thank you for listening to the Connected Community Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe. I can be found at www.nikkiyoga.com, NICKYYYOGA.com. Until I see you again next week, I hope you have a beautiful day.